Welcome back to the channel, everyone. It is absolutely wonderful to have you here with us again as we continue our deep dive into the forgotten, highly lucrative wisdom of the past. If you are new to our community, please take a quick moment right now to hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and make sure your notifications are turned on so you never miss a journey back in time. I also want to hear from you directly. Leave a comment down below and tell me where in the world you are watching from, and if you remember your parents or grandparents preserving food without relying on a modern refrigerator. Your engagement, your stories, and your support are the absolute lifeblood of this channel. It is the only way we can beat the modern algorithm and keep bringing these incredible, money-saving historical secrets back into the light where they belong. Today, we are tackling a subject that is currently draining thousands of dollars from your bank account every single year without you even realizing it: the way we store our food. We live in a modern era where we place absolute blind faith in a massive, humming, electricity-hungry monolith sitting in the center of our kitchens. We believe that the modern refrigerator, and specifically the massive deep freezer, is the ultimate tool for financial savings. We buy groceries in bulk from massive warehouse club stores. We proudly haul our plastic-wrapped packages home, and we shove them into the freezing depths of our appliances, patting ourselves on the back for being so financially responsible. But what if I told you that the modern freezer is actually one of the greatest financial traps of the 21st century? What if the ultimate secret to building lasting wealth and ensuring your family's food security was perfected in the 1950s by housewives who actively refused to rely on freezing their food? To fundamentally understand this lost financial secret, we have to completely reevaluate our modern relationship with the concept of cold storage. Today, we view the massive double-door refrigerator and the chest freezer in the garage as absolute non-negotiable necessities of human survival. But if we transport ourselves back to a typical middle-class kitchen in the early 1950s, the landscape looks radically different. While electric refrigerators had become standard in American homes, they were incredibly small compared to the gargantuan models we use today. More importantly, the freezer compartment in a 1950s refrigerator was often nothing more than a tiny, frost-covered metal box at the very top of the unit, barely large enough to hold 2 aluminum ice cube trays and perhaps a single pint of vanilla ice cream for a Sunday treat. Standalone deep freezers existed, but they were expensive luxury appliances that the average frugal, single-income household simply could not afford and did not want to pay the electrical bill to run. The 1950s homemaker, who had learned the brutal lessons of scarcity during the Great Depression and the severe rationing programs of the Second World War, knew that relying entirely on a fragile electrical grid to preserve her family's wealth was a fool's errand. A single severe winter storm or a blown transformer could result in the catastrophic loss of hundreds of dollars of meat and produce in a matter of days. Because of this intense vulnerability, the 1950s housewife operated under a brilliant defensive culinary philosophy. She mastered the lost art of ambient temperature preservation. She knew how to manipulate the natural chemistry of food so that it could sit safely on a dark pantry shelf, in a cool basement, or in a ceramic crock for months, sometimes even years, without ever needing to be plugged into a wall outlet. Today, our reliance on the freezer has created a massive silent financial leak in our households. We use our freezers not as preservation tools, but as procrastination chambers. We throw expensive cuts of meat, fresh seasonal berries, and leftover meals into the icy depths because we don't want to deal with them today. Months later, we dig through the frost and pull out unrecognizable freezer-burned blocks of ice. The cellular structure of the food has been completely destroyed by the expanding ice crystals. The flavor has mutated into a dull metallic freezer taste, and the texture has turned to absolute mush. Ultimately, we end up throwing away staggering amounts of this ruined food, literally dumping our hard-earned cash directly into the garbage can. The modern freezer gives us a false sense of security, blinding us to the fact that we are wasting massive amounts of money. The women of the 1950s did not have the luxury of using extreme cold as a crutch for laziness. They treated food preservation as a rigorous, highly scientific, and profoundly financial undertaking. They understood that true food security meant transforming highly perishable, cheap in-season harvests into shelf-stable assets that would retain their perfect texture, their vibrant flavor, and their maximum nutritional value throughout the dark, barren months of winter. By relearning their forgotten methods of curing, sealing, and chemical preservation, modern families can completely untether themselves from the fragile electrical grid, stop throwing away freezer-burned money, and build a pantry that functions as an impregnable fortress of culinary wealth. The 1950s money hack wasn't about buying a bigger freezer to store more cheap food. It was about rendering the freezer completely unnecessary through the sheer brilliance of traditional old-world preservation techniques that we desperately need to bring back today. Let us look at one of the most vivid and financially devastating examples of modern food waste, and how the 1950s housewife handled the exact same problem with brilliant efficiency: the preservation of the summer berry harvest. Today, when the brief glorious window of local strawberry, raspberry, or blueberry season arrives, modern consumers rush to the grocery store or the local farmer's market to buy massive flats of deeply discounted, highly perishable fruit. We bring these delicate berries home, wash them, throw them into plastic bags, and toss them directly into the deep freezer, mistakenly believing we've cleverly saved money. But what happens when you attempt to thaw those frozen strawberries in the middle of December to serve over pancakes or bake into a pie? You do not get a firm, vibrant, juicy strawberry. You get a deflated, weeping, gray, gelatinous puddle of mush sitting in a pool of watery, flavorless juice. The violent, rapid expansion of microscopic ice crystals inside the freezer completely shreds the incredibly delicate cellular walls of the fruit. The structural integrity is permanently annihilated. For the frugal 1950s housewife, subjecting an expensive, precious summer harvest to this kind of culinary destruction was absolutely unthinkable. This is the exact reason why the mid-century homemaker actively, aggressively refused to freeze her berries. Instead of relying on the destructive force of freezing temperatures, the 1950s kitchen relied on a powerful ancient form of chemical alchemy, the mastery of sugar, pectin, and the boiling water bath. When the summer berry season peaked and prices plummeted to their absolute lowest, the 1950s kitchen was transformed into a hyper-efficient, high-heat manufacturing facility. The massive canning kettles were brought up from the basement, the glass mason jars were sterilized in boiling water, and the air grew thick and heavy with the intoxicating, sweet aroma of reducing fruit. The secret of 1950s fruit preservation was the intense scientific understanding that sugar is not merely a sweetener. It is a highly aggressive, powerful chemical preservative. When fresh fruit is boiled with a high concentration of sugar, the sugar molecules actively bind to the water molecules within the fruit through a process called osmosis. This effectively draws the moisture out of the microscopic bacteria, molds, and yeasts that cause food to rot, completely destroying their ability to survive and multiply. You are creating a biological environment so intensely hostile to decay that the food can sit safely in a glass jar at room temperature for years. This annual grueling labor of making jams, jellies, compotes, and preserves was not a quaint romantic hobby. It was a massive strategic financial maneuver. A 1950s housewife would purchase a massive crate of strawberries for pennies on the dollar at the height of the summer glut. Through a few hours of intense, focused labor over a hot stove, she would transform that highly perishable crate into 36 tightly sealed glass mason jars of luxury, jewel-toned preserves. When the harsh winter arrived and fresh fruit was absolutely unattainable or astronomically expensive, she simply walked to her pantry shelf and opened a jar. The fruit had not been turned to watery mush by a freezer. The boiling process and the sugar had perfectly captured and intensified the essence of the summer harvest. She used these preserves to flavor cheap morning oatmeal, to spread over dense homemade bread, and to bake into incredible, comforting winter pies, saving the family hundreds of dollars in grocery costs. Today, we go to the modern supermarket, and we happily hand over $6, $7, or even $8 for a tiny boutique jar of artisanal strawberry jam. But if you actually read the ingredient label on the back of mass-produced modern preserves, you will quickly discover that you are paying a massive premium for high fructose corn syrup, artificial food dyes, synthetic chemical preservatives, and cheap water fillers. By reviving the lost 1950s art of the boiling water bath canner, a modern family can completely bypass the predatory pricing of the modern grocery store. You can wait for the local summer harvest when prices hit rock bottom, invest a single Saturday afternoon in the kitchen, and produce a year's supply of organic, incredibly high-quality, shelf-stable fruit preserves for a fraction of the cost. The 1950s housewife teaches us that true financial independence is not achieved by shoving raw ingredients into an expensive electricity-draining appliance and hoping for the best. True wealth is generated by applying your own physical labor and traditional knowledge to permanently alter the chemistry of your food, creating a deeply stocked, beautiful pantry that is completely immune to power outages, freezer burn, and the crippling inflation of the modern supermarket. If you want to witness the absolute peak of forgotten 1950s financial brilliance, we must move away from the fruit orchards and examine one of the most critical, fundamental, and highly volatile staples of the mid-century diet: the humble egg. In our modern, hyper-industrialized 2026 food system, we suffer from a profound, systemic disconnect from the natural biological rhythms of the earth. We walk into a brightly lit, climate-controlled supermarket in the dead freezing center of January, and we fully expect to see massive, towering shelves overflowing with pristine, perfectly uniform, refrigerated white eggs. We have completely forgotten that the production of eggs is a strictly seasonal biological process. Before the advent of modern factory farming, where millions of hens are locked in massive windowless climate-controlled warehouses and subjected to intense artificial 24-hour lighting to force their bodies into endless production, the laying of eggs was dictated entirely by the sun. When the days grew short and the cold winter darkness set in, a hen's natural biological response was to molt her feathers and completely stop laying eggs to conserve her physical energy. Because of this undeniable biological reality, the price of fresh eggs in the 1950s operated on a massive volatile pendulum. In the early spring, as the daylight hours expanded, hens would go into overdrive, producing a massive, overwhelming glut of eggs. Because the supply was so incredibly high, the price of eggs would plummet to absolute rock bottom. But when November arrived and the dark winter set in, the local supply of fresh eggs would vanish almost overnight. The price of whatever meager eggs could be found would skyrocket to exorbitant luxury prices. A modern consumer, faced with this seasonal scarcity, would simply absorb the massive price hike, complain about inflation, and swipe their credit card, bleeding their household budget dry. The 1950s housewife, operating under a strict envelope budget, actively refused to pay luxury prices for a basic staple. Her brilliant forgotten solution was to buy massive quantities of eggs in the spring when they cost mere pennies and preserve them perfectly fresh without a refrigerator to use for her heavy holiday baking in the dead of winter. And the magical lost technique she used to achieve this impossible feat was called water glassing. To understand how water glassing works, you first must understand how the modern American food system actively destroys the natural longevity of an egg. When a hen lays an egg, her body coats the porous shell in a microscopic, invisible, natural protective layer known as the bloom. This bloom acts as a perfect, airtight biological shield, completely sealing the thousands of tiny pores in the eggshell and preventing dangerous, rot-causing bacteria and oxygen from penetrating the interior. In the United States today, commercial regulations require that all factory-farmed eggs be aggressively scrubbed and chemically washed in hot water before they are allowed to be sold. This violent washing process completely strips away the natural bloom, leaving the pores of the egg wide open and entirely defenseless. This is the only reason why modern Americans must obsessively refrigerate their eggs. Without the refrigerator, the washed naked egg will rot in a matter of days. The 1950s housewife bypassed the commercial grocery store entirely. She sourced unwashed farm-fresh eggs with their natural bloom perfectly intact. She would take a large, heavy stoneware crock and place it in the coolest, darkest corner of her pantry or basement. Inside this crock, She would mix a solution of clean water and a chemical compound known as sodium silicate, commonly referred to at the hardware store as water glass, or alternatively, she would use calcium hydroxide known as pickling lime. She would carefully, gently lower the unwashed, pristine spring eggs into this liquid solution until they were completely submerged. The chemical reaction of the liquid would interact with the calcium of the eggshells, effectively creating an impenetrable, airtight, glass-like seal over the entire surface of the egg. This sealed off all oxygen and completely suspended the biological aging process of the egg. The crock was covered and left entirely alone. 6, 8, or even 12 months later, in the freezing depths of January when store-bought eggs were incredibly expensive, the housewife could reach her bare hand into the cold liquid of the crock, pull out an egg that was laid in April, crack it into a frying pan, and the yolk would stand up perfectly round, firm, and vibrant. The egg was as fresh as the day it was laid. The financial implications of this forgotten survival skill are staggering for a modern household. By learning the lost art of water glassing, you can completely insulate your family from the terrifying, unpredictable price spikes and supply chain shortages of the modern grocery store. You can visit a local farmer in the spring, purchase unwashed eggs in massive bulk when the prices are heavily discounted, and safely secure a year's supply of the highest quality, most nutrient-dense protein available, storing it quietly in a bucket in the back of your closet without using a single drop of electricity. The 1950s money hack teaches us that our ancestors were not primitive. They possessed a profound, highly scientific understanding of the natural world. By working with the biology of the food, rather than trying to aggressively fight it with expensive, energy-draining refrigeration, they unlocked massive reserves of hidden wealth right inside their own pantries. As we continue our exploration of how the 1950s household actively bypassed the financial trap of the modern refrigerator, we must move beyond the kitchen pantry and descend into the dark, cool, profoundly important space of the mid-century basement. Today, we treat our basements and garages merely as massive disorganized storage units for holiday decorations, unused exercise equipment, and boxes of old clothes. But to the frugal homeowner of the 1950s, the basement was the ultimate extension of the kitchen. It was a highly managed, strategic climate control zone designed to preserve the heavy bulk harvests of autumn through the long, barren months of winter. We've already discussed the intense fragility of the modern electrical grid and the financial devastation of a thawing deep freezer. But there is another, equally insidious form of food waste that plagues the modern consumer: the crisper drawer of the modern refrigerator. We spend massive amounts of money on expensive, heavy winter vegetables: carrots, beets, potatoes, cabbages, and winter squash. And we carelessly shove them into the brightly lit, heavily ventilated plastic drawers of our refrigerators. The modern refrigerator is designed to aggressively pull moisture out of the air to prevent frost buildup. This incredibly dry, cold environment is absolute poison to root vegetables. Within a few short weeks, the expensive carrots become rubbery, limp, and tasteless, and the potatoes begin to shrivel and sprout, ending up directly in the garbage can. The 1950s homeowner knew that relying on a machine to store heavy vegetables was a massive financial mistake. They relied on the ancient, incredibly effective principles of the root cellar, expertly adapted for the mid-century suburban home. They understood that root vegetables do not need the aggressive, dehydrating cold of an electric motor. They require a delicate, precise balance of cool, stable temperatures and extremely high humidity to remain crisp and alive. In the corner of the basement, furthest away from the heat of the central furnace, families would build heavy wooden bins. When autumn arrived and local farmers were practically giving away root vegetables by the bushel, the family would buy in massive bulk. But they didn't just dump the vegetables into the bins. They employed the brilliant, forgotten preservation technique of sandpacking. A 1950s father would layer the bottom of the wooden bin with coarse, slightly damp sand. He would then meticulously place the unwashed, dirt-covered carrots, beets, and parsnips in a single layer, ensuring that no two vegetables were physically touching. He would cover that layer completely with another thick blanket of damp sand and repeat the process until the bin was full. The damp sand acted as a perfect, natural, zero-electricity climate control system. It trapped the natural moisture inside the cellular walls of the vegetables, completely preventing them from evaporating and turning rubbery. The physical barrier of the sand also ensured that if one single carrot developed a spot of rot, the bacterial decay could not spread and ruin the rest of the winter supply. By utilizing this simple, cheap technique, a family could pull a perfectly crisp, sweet, hard carrot out of the sand in the middle of March, months after the harvest had ended. But the mastery of ambient temperature storage did not stop with vegetables. It extended to the preservation of expensive, high-quality dairy. Today, we buy tiny, incredibly expensive plastic-wrapped blocks of cheese from the supermarket, and despite keeping them in the refrigerator, they inevitably develop fuzzy white and green mold within a few weeks, forcing us to throw our money away. The 1950s family understood the massive economic advantage of buying in bulk. They would purchase massive, heavy wheels of high-quality, hard-aged cheese, often weighing 10 or 20 pounds, directly from a dairy or a local grocer at a steeply discounted bulk price. But you cannot simply leave a massive wheel of cheese exposed to the air. It will rapidly dry out into an inedible brick or become entirely consumed by airborne mold spores. The lost financial secret of the 1950s pantry was the absolute mastery of cheese waxing. The housewife would take the massive wheel of cheese, carefully cut it into manageable family-sized blocks, and prepare a pot of special food-grade preservation wax melted over a double boiler on the stove. She would take each individual block of cheese and meticulously dip it, layer by layer, into the hot liquid wax. The hot wax instantly killed any surface mold spores and created a perfectly impenetrable, airtight, oxygen-free seal around the entire block of cheese. Because the bacteria that causes cheese to rot requires oxygen to survive, this anaerobic environment completely halted the decay process. The wax-sealed blocks of cheese did not require any refrigeration whatsoever. They were simply stacked neatly on a cool, dark wooden shelf in the basement or the pantry. They could sit there safely for years. In fact, rather than rotting, the lack of oxygen allowed the cheese to slowly, beautifully age, developing a sharper, richer, and more complex flavor over time. The financial power of reviving these two lost skills, sandpacking your winter vegetables and wax-sealing bulk cheeses, is absolutely staggering for a modern household budget. It allows you to completely bypass the inflated, off-season prices of the modern supermarket. It allows you to buy food in massive, highly discounted bulk quantities without the terrifying fear of spoilage. And most importantly, it allows you to build a profound, unshakable level of food security for your family that is completely independent of the modern electrical grid. The 1950s housewife did not view her home simply as a place to live. She viewed it as a highly engineered, deeply resilient fortress of wealth preservation. By looking back to the past and reclaiming these lost arts of ambient storage, we can permanently escape the financial trap of the modern freezer, stop throwing our hard-earned money into the garbage can, and build a pantry that truly stands the test of time. As we continue our exploration of how the 1950s household completely bypassed the modern financial trap of the deep freezer, we must address the single most expensive, highly volatile, and stressful category of the modern grocery budget: meat. In the year 2026, protein is treated as a luxury commodity. We walk into the brightly lit aisles of the modern supermarket and we wince at the staggering, hyperinflated prices printed on the small, plastic-wrapped styrofoam trays of beef, pork, and chicken. Because meat represents such a massive financial investment, modern consumers live in a state of constant, low-grade anxiety about its preservation. If we buy meat in bulk to save a few pennies per pound, we immediately throw it into the deep freezer, tying our precious financial capital directly to the fragile, unpredictable electrical grid. A single severe thunderstorm, a downed power line, or a mechanical failure of the compressor can instantly wipe out hundreds or even thousands of dollars of stored protein in a matter of hours. The 1950s housewife, haunted by the visceral memories of meat rationing during the Second World War and the crushing scarcity of the Great Depression, absolutely refused to leave the fate of her family's most valuable food source to the mercy of a power line. Her solution to this terrifying vulnerability was to utilize the most powerful, highly scientific, and fiercely intimidating piece of equipment in the mid-century kitchen, the heavy cast aluminum pressure canner. To the modern consumer, the pressure canner looks like a terrifying relic of the industrial age, a massive metal cauldron equipped with heavy locking clamps, a hissing steam vent, and a precise mechanical pressure dial. But to the frugal homemaker of the 1950s, it was the ultimate engine of wealth preservation and culinary independence. You see, the boiling water bath method we discussed for preserving high-acid fruits and berries is completely useless for preserving low-acid foods like meat, poultry, and unpickled vegetables. If you simply boil a jar of raw beef, the deadly spores of Clostridium botulinum, the bacteria responsible for the fatal illness botulism, will easily survive the boiling temperature of 212 degrees Fahrenheit. These microscopic spores thrive in the oxygen-free environment inside a sealed jar, producing a deadly invisible toxin. The 1950s housewife possessed a deep, highly respectful understanding of this dangerous microbiology. She knew that the absolute only way to safely preserve meat on a pantry shelf at room temperature was to completely obliterate the botulism spores by forcing the temperature of the food well above the boiling point, up to a blistering 240 degrees Fahrenheit. And the only physical way to achieve that extreme, sterilizing heat in a home kitchen was by manipulating the laws of physics under intense, localized pressure. The financial mathematics of pressure canning meat are absolutely staggering, even by today's standards. Because the 1950s household had mastered this preservation technique, they were completely freed from the predatory pricing of the retail butcher counter. They did not buy individual steaks or small, expensive packages of ground beef. They engaged in the lost art of extreme bulk purchasing. A family might pool their cash with a neighbor to buy an entire half of a cow, a whole hog, or a massive flock of tough, older laying hens directly from a local farmer at absolute rock-bottom wholesale prices. They would bring this massive haul of meat into the kitchen and spend days engaged in the grueling, highly skilled labor of butchering and packing. They would cube the tough, cheap cuts of beef, pack them tightly into sterilized glass quart jars, add a single teaspoon of coarse salt, and lock the heavy metal lid of the pressure canner into place. As the heat rose and the pressure built to exactly 10 or 15 pounds per square inch, the heavy metal jiggler on the vent would begin its rhythmic, frantic dancing, filling the hot kitchen with the hissing sound of trapped steam. This sound was the literal heartbeat of the mid-century survival kitchen. What emerged from that pressure canner 90 minutes later was nothing short of a financial and culinary miracle. As the glass jars cooled on the wooden kitchen table, the intense vacuum seal would suddenly snap shut with a loud metallic ping, the most satisfying sound in the frugal homemaker's world. Inside those sealed jars, the intense pressurized heat had not only completely sterilized the meat, rendering it perfectly safe to sit on a dark basement shelf for 3 to 5 years without a single watt of electricity. It had also performed an astonishing feat of culinary alchemy. The brutal 240-degree heat had completely broken down the tough, inedible connective tissues and heavy collagen of the cheapest cuts of meat, transforming them into melt-in-your-mouth, fork-tender morsels suspended in a rich, deeply savory, gelatinous broth. The modern family spends exorbitant amounts of money and time utilizing expensive slow cookers, electric pressure cookers, and meal delivery services to achieve what the 1950s housewife had sit on her shelf in abundance. The pressure-canned meat was the original zero-electricity fast food. On a busy Wednesday evening, or during a massive winter blizzard when the power lines were down and the roads were impassable, she did not panic. She simply walked down to the basement, selected a jar of home-canned beef, popped the vacuum seal, and poured the incredibly tender meat and rich broth over a pot of cheap egg noodles or mashed potatoes. Within 10 minutes, she'd produced a luxurious, hearty, deeply satisfying meal that had cost her mere pennies per serving. By reviving the lost, intimidating art of the pressure canner, A modern family can completely insulate their grocery budget from the devastating shockwaves of meat inflation, safely capitalize on massive bulk meat discounts, and build an impregnable, shelf-stable protein vault that will effortlessly outlast any power outage or modern crisis. While the pressure canner was the heavy artillery of the 1950s preservation arsenal, utilizing extreme heat and intense pressure to conquer the vulnerabilities of meat, there was another entirely different, astonishingly elegant, and completely zero-cost method of preservation that dominated the mid-century household. To fully grasp this technique, we must understand the fundamental biological enemy of all food storage. The single factor that causes vegetables to rot, fruits to mold, and bread to spoil is the presence of moisture. Water is the biological catalyst for all cellular decay. The modern deep freezer attempts to aggressively fight this decay by using massive amounts of expensive electricity to violently freeze the water inside the food into destructive ice crystals. But the frugal, deeply resourceful housewife of the 1950s looked at the problem of moisture and applied a radically different, ancient, and highly effective logic. Instead of freezing the water, she simply removed it entirely. She was a master of the lost art of extreme, zero-energy dehydration. Today, if a modern consumer wants to dehydrate food, they typically log onto an internet retailer and spend hundreds of dollars on a massive, humming plastic appliance equipped with electric heating coils and noisy plastic fans. They plug it into the wall, driving up their monthly utility bill to dry a few delicate slices of expensive organic fruit. To the 1950s homeowner, spending hard-earned cash on a specialized electrical appliance simply to dry food would have been viewed as a profound absurdity. They understood that they already possessed access to the most powerful, infinite, and absolutely free sources of dehydrating energy on the planet: the blazing heat of the summer sun, the arid airflow of a drafty attic, and the ambient residual heat radiating from the cast-iron kitchen stove. The 1950s money hack was the brilliant utilization of the environment they already inhabited, transforming the very architecture of their homes into massive passive food preservation engines. One of the most iconic, highly visible, and heavily relied upon examples of this zero-cost preservation was the creation of leather britches, also known as shucky beans. When the massive, overwhelming late summer harvest of green pole beans arrived from the backyard relief garden, the sheer volume was often too great to process entirely in the pressure canner. Furthermore, glass mason jars and metal canning lids cost precious pennies, and the frugal housewife was loath to waste them if another method existed. Instead, the family would gather on the front porch on a warm evening. Armed with heavy darning needles and long lengths of thick cotton thread, they would meticulously string hundreds of fresh, whole green beans together, creating massive, heavy green necklaces of food. These long strings of beans were then hung directly from the wooden rafters of the hot, dry attic, strung across the ceiling of the kitchen near the stove, or hung on the back porch where the dry summer breeze could hit them. Over the course of several weeks, the dry air and ambient heat would slowly, gently draw every single drop of moisture out of the cellular structure of the beans. They would radically shrivel, shrink, and turn a pale, dry, leathery green, hence the name leather britches. When they were completely devoid of moisture, they sounded like dry, hollow wood when tapped together. In this completely dehydrated state, the biological mechanism for rot was entirely eliminated. The strings of beans could be left hanging from the rafters indefinitely, or packed tightly into large, cheap cloth sacks and stored in the pantry for years without spoiling. The financial and spatial efficiency of this method was absolutely staggering. A massive, towering bushel of fresh, bulky green beans, which would have taken up impossible amounts of space in a modern freezer, was reduced to a fraction of its original volume, easily fitting into a single canvas sack in the back of a closet. This zero-cost method was aggressively applied to absolutely everything the family harvested. Apples were painstakingly peeled, cored, sliced into thin rings, and slid onto long wooden dowels or broomsticks suspended across the kitchen to dry into chewy, sweet, concentrated apple rings. Massive bunches of culinary and medicinal herbs, sage, thyme, rosemary, and mint, were tied with twine and hung upside down in the windowsills to crisp in the sun. Sweet corn was cut directly from the cob and spread out on massive wooden screens covered in cheesecloth, placed on the slanted tin roof of a shed to aggressively bake and dry in the brutal August sun until the kernels were as hard as glass. When the freezing, dark winter months arrived and fresh produce was a distant memory, the magic of this zero-cost preservation was truly realized. The housewife did not need to thaw a block of freezer-burned mush. She simply took a handful of the dried, shriveled leather britches or dried corn kernels and threw them into a heavy cast-iron pot filled with simmering, rich bone broth and a cheap cut of salted pork. Over the course of several hours of slow cooking, the miraculous process of rehydration occurred. The dry, leathery vegetables eagerly absorbed the rich, savory broth, swelling back to their original size and transforming into incredibly tender, deeply flavorful, highly nutritious components of a massive winter stew. The modern family can effortlessly replicate this immense financial victory. By learning to harness the passive ambient heat of the summer sun or simply utilizing the residual cooling heat of your modern oven after you have finished baking, you can completely preserve massive amounts of cheap seasonal produce without buying a single glass jar, without purchasing a plastic dehydrator appliance, and without using a single drop of electricity for long-term storage. You are literally turning air and time into stored, shelf-stable wealth. As we delve deeper into the forgotten survival mechanics of the 1950s pantry, we must confront a massive, deeply ingrained psychological barrier that modern society has constructed around food. In our highly sanitized, hyper-industrialized 2026 culture, we have been aggressively conditioned by advertising and corporate messaging to be absolutely terrified of bacteria. We spend billions of dollars annually on harsh chemical sanitizers, antibacterial soaps, and heavily pasteurized, sterile food products, believing that the only safe food is dead food. But the frugal, deeply knowledgeable homemaker of the 1950s possessed a radically different, highly sophisticated understanding of microbiology. She knew that not all microscopic life was the enemy. In fact, she understood that harnessing and manipulating specific, highly beneficial strains of wild bacteria was the ultimate zero-energy secret to building an impenetrable biological force field around her family's food supply. She was a master of the ancient transformative art of lactofermentation. Today, if you walk down the condiment aisle of a modern supermarket and purchase a jar of pickles or a bag of sauerkraut, you are almost universally buying a product that has been aggressively boiled, sterilized, and submerged in harsh, distilled white vinegar. This modern industrial process guarantees a long, sterile shelf life, but it completely destroys the natural nutritional profile of the food and produces a flat, one-dimensional, harsh, acidic flavor. The 1950s housewife did not rely on store-bought vinegar to preserve her massive autumn harvest of vegetables. She relied on the invisible wild lactic acid bacteria that naturally exists on the surface of all vegetables grown in the earth. The financial brilliance of this method lay in its shocking simplicity. To preserve 50 pounds of dense, heavy autumn cabbage, she did not need expensive glass canning jars, she did not need the extreme heat of the pressure canner, and she certainly did not need the electricity of a deep freezer. This intense physical labor broke down the rigid cellular walls of the cabbage, allowing the salt to aggressively draw out the natural water hidden inside the vegetable. Within hours, the cabbage would begin to weep, creating its own natural cloudy liquid brine. Once the cabbage was completely submerged under its own liquid, a heavy wooden plate was placed on top, weighed down by a large, smooth river stone carefully selected from the yard. The crock was then pushed into the darkest, coolest corner of the basement and left entirely alone. What happened inside that heavy stoneware crock over the next 6 weeks was a microscopic war for survival, and the housewife had perfectly engineered the environment to ensure that the good bacteria would win. The heavy salt concentration in the brine completely suppressed the growth of dangerous rot-causing bacteria and molds that cause food to spoil. However, the salt-tolerant, highly beneficial lactic acid bacteria, which naturally clung to the cabbage leaves, thrived in this specific environment. As these microscopic organisms consumed the natural sugars in the cabbage, they produced massive amounts of lactic acid as a byproduct. This powerful natural lactic acid aggressively lowered the pH of the entire crock, creating a biological environment so highly acidic that no pathogenic harmful bacteria could possibly survive. The financial and nutritional impact of this biological alchemy was absolutely staggering. The fermentation process did not just preserve the cheap cabbage, it fundamentally transformed it into a powerful, life-saving superfood. The lactic acid bacteria actively synthesized massive amounts of new vitamins, dramatically increasing the vitamin C content of the cabbage to levels far higher than when it was fresh from the garden. In the dark, freezing, brutal depths of the 1950s winter, when fresh citrus fruits were an unattainable luxury and vitamin deficiencies were a genuine physical threat, that bubbling crock of sauerkraut sitting in the basement was not just a side dish. It was a cheap, highly potent, shelf-stable vitamin supplement that kept the entire family healthy and strong. The flavor was not the harsh, dead vinegar bite of a modern supermarket pickle. It was a complex, deeply savory, bright, and tangy profile that elevated the cheapest cuts of pork and potatoes into a feast. By reviving the lost, intimidating art of the fermentation crock, a modern family can completely revolutionize their grocery budget and their health. You can take the cheapest, most abundant, bulkiest vegetables available at the autumn harvest, cabbage, cucumbers, carrots, and radishes, and transform them into highly valuable, deeply nutritious, shelf-stable assets using absolutely nothing but a handful of salt and the ambient temperature of your own home. You bypass the modern industrial food system entirely, refusing to pay for sterile, dead food in plastic bags. The 1950s homemaker teaches us that the greatest, most powerful tools for financial survival are not found in modern appliances or complex budgeting apps. They are found by confidently partnering with the natural microscopic forces of the world around us. We have painstakingly deconstructed the brilliant, highly tactical mechanics of the 1950s food preservation system. We have seen how the mid-century homemaker utilized the blistering heat of the pressure canner to build an impregnable protein vault without the vulnerability of a deep freezer. We have explored the massive financial savings of zero-cost, ambient dehydration, the ingenious chemical alchemy of water-glassing eggs, the microclimate mastery of sand-packing vegetables in the root cellar, and the biological force field created by the fermentation crock. But as we reach the conclusion of this deep dive into the frugal survival strategies of the past, we must uncover the final, most profound and deeply transformative secret of all. The ultimate reason the 1950s generation engaged in this grueling, time-consuming physical labor was not just about the mathematical reality of saving pennies. It was about achieving a massive, unshakable psychological victory. The greatest, most powerful money hack of the 1950s was the immense psychological wealth generated by the physical existence of the stocked pantry. To truly understand this, we must contrast it with the deep, relentless psychological anxiety of the modern 2026 consumer. Today, despite living in an era of unprecedented technological convenience and globalized supply chains, we are fundamentally, terrifyingly vulnerable. Our entire existence is completely dependent on a fragile, just-in-time delivery system over which we have absolutely zero control. When we walk into a massive, brightly lit supermarket today, we do not feel empowered. We feel exploited. We watch helplessly as the prices of basic staples, eggs, flour, meat, and vegetables wildly fluctuate and skyrocket due to inflation, corporate greed, and global crises. We swipe our credit cards, feeling a sickening sense of dread as a massive portion of our paycheck instantly vanishes just to secure a week's worth of highly processed, quickly perishing food. The modern consumer operates from a position of deep financial defense, constantly at the absolute mercy of the retail grocery system. The 1950s housewife, standing at the bottom of her basement stairs in the fading light of a November afternoon, experienced a psychological reality that most modern humans cannot even begin to comprehend. When she looked at the heavy wooden shelves she and her husband had built, she did not see a mere storage area. She saw a vast, deeply beautiful, tangible manifestation of her family's absolute independence. She saw hundreds of heavy glass mason jars glowing like jewels in the dim light, the deep, rich ruby red of preserved beets and strawberry jams, the bright, cheerful golden yellow of canned peaches and sweet corn, the dark, savory, comforting brown of pressure-canned beef stews and rich bone broths. She saw the heavy stoneware crocks bubbling quietly with life-saving fermented cabbage, the massive wooden bins filled with damp sand protecting hundreds of pounds of crisp root vegetables, and the heavy canvas sacks bulging with dehydrated beans and dried apples hanging securely from the rafters. This was not just food. This was concentrated, highly protected, undeniable wealth. The physical existence of that fully stocked pantry acted as an impenetrable psychological armor against the terrifying uncertainties of the world. It fundamentally altered the way the family interacted with the economy. If the husband's factory went on strike and his paycheck suddenly stopped, they did not immediately panic or face the threat of starvation. They had a year's worth of high-quality food safely secured behind glass and wax. If the national economy dipped into a severe recession and the prices at the local grocer skyrocketed overnight, the housewife simply smiled, walked right past the expensive aisles, and relied on the immense inflation-proof wealth she had already generated with her own two hands. She had successfully transformed herself from a helpless, vulnerable consumer into a powerful, resilient, deeply independent producer. This is the ultimate profound lesson we must take away from our grandparents. You can clip modern digital coupons, you can download budgeting apps, and you can endlessly chase the sales at the massive warehouse club stores. But as long as you rely on the modern fragile system of immediate consumption and the vulnerable crutch of the electric deep freezer, you will always be a victim to the unpredictable whims of the economy. True financial peace, the kind of deep restorative peace that allows you to sleep soundly at night regardless of what the stock market or the grocery prices are doing, cannot be bought on credit. It must be slowly, deliberately built. It is built by taking extreme, proactive ownership of your resources, by relearning the lost, intimidating skills of traditional preservation, and by refusing to outsource your family's basic survival to a corporation. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible, eye-opening journey into the lost culinary and financial wisdom of the 1950s. I truly hope this video has inspired you to look at your own kitchen, your own grocery budget, and your own capabilities through a radically different, far more empowered lens. If you found deep value in these forgotten survival secrets, please do me a massive favor and hit that like button right now. It sends a powerful signal to the algorithm that this vital history is worth sharing with the world. Make sure you subscribe and turn on all notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into the past. And right now, I want you to head down to the comments section and tell me your story. What was the most fascinating preservation method your parents or grandparents used? Have you ever tried pressure canning, water glassing eggs, or making your own sauerkraut? I read every single comment, and your shared knowledge is what keeps the brilliant, resilient spirit of that generation alive. Until next time, remember that the most powerful financial moves aren't always found in a modern app. Sometimes, the absolute best way to secure your future is to embrace the hard-won wisdom of the past. We will see you in the next video.